Welcome to this masterclass. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating and absolutely crucial topic, the framework that balances a relentless drive for economic development with the urgent need to protect our environment. Think of this explainer as your complete guide to the environmental impact assessment in India. If you've ever looked at a massive new construction project and wondered, how does the government make sure this doesn't totally destroy the local ecosystem? Well, you're in the right place. We're going to break down the exact mechanisms that make this delicate balancing act possible. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with a quick introduction to EIA, look at its core purposes, trace its history in India, map out geographically restricted zones, list out the massive projects that require central clearance, and finally, tie it all back to achieving global sustainable development. Let's get right into it. Part 1. Introduction to EIA. Let's understand the baseline. So when we say environmental impact assessment, what are we actually talking about? Well, it's easy to assume it's strictly about, counting trees and protecting wildlife, but it's actually much broader than that. Officially, an EIA is a process used to identify the environmental, social, and economic impacts of proposed developments. It's a highly comprehensive, cross-disciplinary evaluation. We're looking at the whole picture here, how a project affects nature, yes, but also how it impacts local communities and the broader economy. By identifying all these impacts super early in the process, the EIA gives us a superpower, the ability to actually mitigate adverse effects before a single shovel hits the dirt. It fundamentally serves as an information bridge. It takes all this incredibly complex technical data and translates it into clear, actionable options for both everyday citizens and government decision makers. Moving on to part 2, the core purposes of an EIA. Why do we actually do all this assessing? The entire EIA framework is driven by 3 foundational goals, and they brilliantly build from the immediate local level all the way up to the global scale. Number 1 is to facilitate decision-making. Number 2 is to aid in the formation of the development itself. And number 3, the big one, is to serve as an instrument for sustainable development. Let's unpack these. First up, facilitating decision-making. Imagine your local authority tasked with approving a massive new factory. An EIA is invaluable for you. It literally forces a pause, a mandatory timeout, to systematically examine the environmental implications and look at alternative options before any irreversible decision is locked in. All of this rigorous research is then compiled into an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. That document becomes the definitive, go-to reference guide for the folks making the final call. Now, for the second purpose, aiding in how a development actually takes shape. Developers often look at an EIA as just another bureaucratic hurdle, but integrating it early is actually a massive strategic advantage. It provides a framework to think about location and design right alongside environmental issues. This means developers can tweak their projects early on to minimize or completely eliminate adverse impacts. The result? You get environmentally sensitive development, way better relationships with local communities and planning authorities, and, believe it or not, a smoother permission process. It can even yield better financial returns because you avoid having to do costly last-minute redesigns. All right, part 3. Let's look at the history of EIA in India, tracing its journey from a basic administrative check to strict statutory law. It's genuinely fascinating how this evolved. Back in 1976 and 1977, this process started as merely an administrative check. The Planning Commission basically just asked the Department of Science and Technology to look at River Valley projects from an environmental angle. There were no real legal teeth to it. But the major turning point hit in May 1986 with the enactment of the Environment Protection Act, which finally laid down a solid legal foundation. Then, on January 27, 1994, a pivotal notification was issued. This was a game changer. It made environmental impact assessments fully statutory, meaning legally required and binding for 30 specific types of activities. Part 4. Geographically restricted zones. Sometimes it's not just about what you're building, but exactly where you're building it. Under that 1986 Act, the government took a highly surgical, location-specific approach to protecting the environment. Check out this progression. In February 1989, they stepped in to restrict industries and mining in the Don Valley. Then in 1991, we see the Coastal Regulation Zone enacted to protect coastal stretches alongside specific restrictions for Dahanu Taluka in Maharashtra. This targeted shielding just kept expanding, protecting the Aravoli Range in May 1992 and the region northwest of Numalagarh in Assam by July 1996. They were fiercely protecting these sensitive hotspots from pollution and industrial congestion. Which brings us to Part 5, projects requiring central clearance. Let's look at exactly what types of developments trigger this mandatory approval. As I mentioned earlier, that 1994 notification made the EIA statutory for 30 specific activities. We're talking about massive, high-impact operations spanning multiple industrial sectors. To make sense of this huge regulatory list, we've broken it down into a few distinct, logical themes. Let's start with the projects that leave the absolute largest physical footprints: energy and infrastructure. This first category is all about infrastructure that literally reshapes the landscape or demands immense amounts of energy. So we're talking immediate central scrutiny for things like nuclear and thermal power plants, major river valley projects like hydropower, irrigation and flood control, and massive transport hubs like your big ports, harbors, and airports. The regulatory threshold here is all about scale and physical disruption. The rules even specify that laying down tarred roads in the Himalayas or forest areas, or building tourism projects above 1,000 meters in elevation that cost more than 5 crore rupees, absolutely require clearance. Next up, we have heavy extractive and primary metallurgical industries. Because of their intense, undeniable environmental footprint, central clearance is legally mandatory for any mining lease covering more than 5 hectares. That's a strict baseline. Additionally, the foundational production facilities for metals, iron, steel, aluminum, copper, zinc, lead, and ferroalloys, along with electroplating operations, fall firmly under this mandatory requirement. You simply cannot launch these without a rigorous assessment. The regulations also keep a very tight leash on the volatile chemical and petroleum sectors, and this covers the entire life cycle of fossil fuels, from the initial oil and gas exploration and extraction to the transport, storage, refineries, and crude pipelines. Furthermore, to prevent catastrophic wide-scale pollution, the manufacturing of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, complex petrochemicals, basic plastics, and even bulk drugs and pharmaceuticals must be rigorously assessed. The stakes with these chemicals are just too high to skip the EIA. Finally, there's a broad catch-all category covering heavy industrial manufacturing and materials processing. This captures the production of highly reactive or hazardous substances like synthetic rubber, asbestos products, and hydrocyanic acid. But it also includes massive processing plants for everyday materials: pulp, paper, newsprint, dyes, cement, distilleries, and raw hides. The guiding principle here is simple. If a facility has the potential to pump out significant chemical or organic waste on an industrial scale, it has to clear the EIA hurdle before anyone breaks ground. All right, part 6, achieving sustainable development. Let's zoom out and look at the global perspective. Earlier, we established that the third overarching purpose of an EIA is to serve as an instrument for sustainable development. But how do we measure that? Well, the true test of any assessment is whether it helps us maintain our overall quality of life, whether it ensures continuing access to natural resources for future generations, and whether it completely avoids lasting, irreversible environmental damage. These hyperlocal assessments we've been talking about, they're the foundational building blocks in our fight against massive existential global issues like ozone depletion, climate change, and deforestation. And tackling those requires unwavering global political commitment. This national framework in India actually echoes the watershed global commitments that were established at the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, often just called the Earth Summit, in Rio de Janeiro. Rio 92 was a massive moment. It highlighted profound international concern, but it also exposed just how incredibly difficult it is to secure unified, concerted action on a global scale. It proved conclusively that we need systemic, institutional responses at every single level of governance, from the local town hall to the UN. There's a brilliant quote that summarizes this paradigm shift in modern governments perfectly. It states, "Governments have recognized the interaction of economic and social development and the ecosystems and the reciprocal impact between human actions and the biogeophysical world." What this means is that we can no longer treat human progress in the natural environment as isolated silos. They are deeply reciprocally linked. Every single economic action triggers a biological reaction. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider this dynamic. The environmental impact assessment framework we've explored today represents a massive leap forward. From simple, toothless administrative checks in the 1970s to the robust statutory law we rely on today. But as human demand accelerates, how will future innovations and policies continue to bridge that ever-widening gap between our relentless demand for economic development and the critical, unyielding limits of our ecosystems? And on a more personal level, how well do you think your own local projects are balancing this delicate equation right now? Thank you so much for joining this masterclass. Keep questioning, and definitely keep a close eye on the development happening in your own backyard.